What the hell is long COVID? Chapter 7. Drugzzz. I'm writing a book here, not an encyclopedia. So when I say this is how COVID attacks, I don't mean to say there's nothing else that can be said about it. In fact, lots more can and will be helpful. But what I've presented previously is the basics. Once you understand that, you'll be able to sift through the blogs and the talking head barrages and critically evaluate, okay, why might such and such habit, supplement, food, drug, etc. help me, instead of just swing and a miss, lather, rinse, and repeat. SARS-CoV-2 is a chimera. It's a bunch of different things globbed together, and as such it has a bunch of different attack mechanisms. The spike, the immunogenic protein configuration, and the resulting overenthusiastic immune response are the stars of the show. They're the battering ram that knocks the gate down. But there's plenty more detail that follows after COVID has sunk its teeth into you. Thus, for the sake of completeness, I've included this chapter to cover some of the subsequent questions you might be asking right now. Why do certain apparently random drugs, e.g. antihistamines, statins, Saruman, etc., seem to help for some people? Why do certain supplements help, etc.? Now, I've said it previously, and I'll say it again. I consider drugs chemical surgery. In other words, I believe there's a legitimate place for drugs, just like there's a legitimate place for surgery. But just like I wouldn't get gassed and knifed on a whim, I likewise avoid drugs unless the situation seems to call for chemical surgery. And sometimes it does, especially when there's a situation that calls for a scorched earth policy. But generally, drugs are highly potent chemical agents that force your body to act or respond in a certain way to achieve a result no matter what. As far as I can tell, the term drug doesn't refer so much to the substance of the thing, so much as how we use that thing. I've learned over and over again, we humans have very little insight as to what is actually happening in our body in a complete, interrelated sense. Forcing your body to do something in this manner is like using physical force to teach a student a lesson. The student might indeed learn, but man, more often than not, it seems like chemical surgery is like this. Yeah, you forced the body to stop the inflammation or killed the bacteria or stop the symptoms, but... So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. But I will say this. I've absolutely used some over-the-counters and prescription drugs in this context, primarily because COVID is so unnatural. And also, I admit, I wanted to do a little live research, so to speak, so I could talk to the people who also use them. But I feel it's warranted to use some scorched earth policy here in certain contexts. That being said, I feel like a lot of the stars of the show drugs on this scene, interestingly, are actually less forceful than most. Ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, low-dose naltrexone, etc. Very nuanced in their approach. But, of course, it's up to you. I'll tell you why I think they might work here, and you can decide whether you want to do chemical surgery. We've already covered ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, so I won't repeat on those. But there's a few more names you might have heard, and you may be wondering, why are these helpful here? Here's the scoop on most of these, or my theory, take it or leave it, on how they work, why they help some people and not others, and why some of them only work a few weeks before becoming ineffective. Basically, most of these drugs are designed to target certain cellular receptors. They have a strong affinity for them. If COVID-induced autoantibodies happen to be clogging those same receptor types, those drugs will bop off those autoantibodies, allowing the cell a chance to breathe, so to speak, or to function, eliminating your long COVID symptoms. Since it's a complete dice roll as to exactly what autoantibodies you've generated, there's no guarantee that any of these will work for you. If receptor X is being clogged by COVID autoantibodies, and a given drug happens to target X, then it might help you. But if not, you're out of luck. Just because it worked for your pal doesn't mean it'll work for you. So let's run through these very quickly. GPCR drugs. GPCR drugs, meaning G-protein-coupled receptors, a wide collection of common and well-researched cellular receptors that are targeted by approximately 40% of all FDA-approved drugs. You've undoubtedly heard of many of these receptors. Opioid receptors, histamine receptors, angiotensin, ACE receptors, etc. are all GPCRs. Some people report that H1 or H2 blockers, aka antihistamines such as Zyrtec, Claritin, etc., seem to help with their long COVID symptoms. Why is that? Well, think about it. The H1 or H2 blocker has a competitive affinity for histamine receptors type 1 and 2, respectively. In other words, they latch onto and potentially bop off other things that have a weaker affinity. These drugs will help people who happen to have COVID-induced autoantibodies, clogging up their H1 and H2 receptors by bopping off those autoantibodies and giving those cells a chance to work again. The autoantibodies could glob right back on when the antihistamine wears off, but the cell had a chance to breathe, and that's important. Antihistamines are one of the more prominent examples of the GPCR drug class, also montelukast, suramin, and many others you might have heard of in this context. I tried montelukast and had horrible side effects, incidentally. But pretty much whenever somebody says XYZ is the wonder drug for COVID, with the exception of ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, it's probably actually just a GPCR that happens to help some people by bopping off some autoantibodies. I'm going to give low-dose naltrexone a special mention in this category. LDN competes for opioid receptors, one of the most common and important receptors found body-wide. I've had fantastic luck with LDN. In simple terms, LDN shut down manually my sustained immune response and helped bring that back to homeostasis. Quick note as well, you may have heard that smoking tobacco or pot is good for COVID. Smoking either of these two competes for your opioid receptors, giving those autoantibodies competition. Sorry to break some tough news to the smoking crowd, it's not good for COVID. That particular narrow aspect may, in some people, depending on how the dice rolled, be helpful. But if you want to get the same or better results, just take a drug that competes for the opioid receptors, like low-dose naltrexone, or take cold showers. Corticosteroids. As I've said, forcing our body to fix itself is a bit like forcing a child to learn a lesson. These steroids force your body to lower inflammation. Sometimes you may need that. Rarely, in my estimation, but your doc might disagree. I personally know at least several people for whom steroids have made their autoimmune situation go from bad to Russian novel dramatic bad. Basically, the long and short of it is that you might need some inflammation. Inflammation isn't a bad thing. It has the dual function of A, focusing healing on a certain area, and B, preventing the bad thing from that area from spreading by clogging up the works. Force your body to stop the inflammation, and it may feel better for a time, but suddenly the area may not heal as thoroughly, and the bad guys may now have free access to your body's blood flow highways. The other drugs here make sense to me, but I'm not sure about statins. To be honest, though, I haven't looked into them much because of how potent they are and their side effects. The last thing I need is to slam my body with some strange chemical and hope for the best. If I had to conjecture, and take it for what it is, conjecture, statins could help certain people with high cholesterol levels, if that's the bad cholesterol, who need help unclogging their blood flow from said cholesterol, i.e. to help alleviate COVID hypoxia. Do I know that? No. But that'd be my conjecture, based on a little that I've researched statins. Again, I wrote them off pretty quickly. Also, one quick side note is that apparently COVID needs cholesterol to replicate. That could be statins' mode of action as well. But you can stop COVID's replication much more easily in other ways. Personally, I'm staying away from statins, but you're not reading this for medical advice, of course, so it's all good. Apheresis. If you've never heard of apheresis, it's basically where blood is pumped out of your body, manually filtered and put back in again. As you can imagine, expensive, tough to find, tough to access, etc., etc. There are many different kinds, different filter types, etc. Some use UV light or ozone, etc. This one is simply out of my price range. I don't know much about it, but I wanted to mention it. It sounds like it would be super helpful, but there's no way on earth I'll ever have access to it. BC.007. Ch.7 is an experimental stage drug produced by a German company called Berlin Cures that I've mentioned earlier. It's essentially a synthetic DNA aptamer, i.e. a partial sequence, that's designed to bind autoantibodies and neutralize them, similar to how ivermectin binds spike. Does it work? How effective is it? Is it effective for all long COVID? I'm not sure the answer to these questions, but for me the importance of Ch.7 was illustrating, via the published studies, how these autoantibodies work in long COVID. First and foremost, they clog. Together with spike, they cause COVID hypoxia. I may not have access to an experimental drug, and honestly, I'm a little bit hesitant to ingest anything that involves DNA aptamer-based drugs until I know more about it, but I have a sauna. I have DMSO, and I can let my tissue breathe. Honorable mention, spironolactone. I got whacked by EBV, also known as mono, and spironolactone, apparently, as far as I can tell, deactivated it and stuffed it back into its box. I'll deal with it later, and don't tell me there's no way of ever getting rid of it. Maybe, maybe not. Forgive my cynicism, but the "you can't ever heal from this" statements, by this point, yeah. One more quick comment. It's worth noting that none of these drugs purport to dissolve the real thug in long COVID, the amyloid clots. So to me, it's not mysterious as to why they're overmatched. Whatever it is that dissolves amyloid clots, DMSO or something else, it appears it's not going to be sheer chemical force that dissolves it. Well, that's my 2 cents on drugs. To thine own self be true, unless thine own self has been bamboozled. Take it or leave it. I'm sort of a stodgy cynic when it comes to drugs. I'd just urge you to do 2 things. A, consider the philosophy of medicine, what you're trying to do in the big picture, and the logic of healing generally. And then, should you so desire, B, talk to a doctor you trust if you have questions about drugs. Sometimes, chemical surgery is appropriate.